Welcome to A Well Cared For Human, the podcast that tries to convince you that you are 100% normal and an even better than okay example of the human species, despite the fact that sometimes we feel like the craziest, most incapable, or worthless creatures on the face of this planet. I'm Corey, an author, a creative, and the host of the show. Whatever you're bringing to the table today, I hope this episode proves to be a dose of inspiration for you on your quest to become a well-cared-for human. You can find the episode show notes, your free wellness blueprint, and more at awellcaredforhuman.com. And as always, thank you for listening. Hello humans, it's your host Corey, and today we're going to talk about comparisonitis. And this has an adjacent quality to the episode I released a few weeks ago on imposter syndrome. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, please go back and listen to it if you're struggling with imposter syndrome as well. But essentially, this episode idea came to me because I am very guilty of comparing myself to other people, particularly in the area of accomplishments. And I don't know why I have this compulsion to figure out if I'm behind, if I'm ahead, am I succeeding, am I failing? I'm always trying to contextualize myself against the lives of other people, even though we're all on our own paths and we're all doing our own thing, and you can't remotely compare your life to any other. Doesn't stop me from trying, though. And comparisonitis, if you're not familiar with the term, if that's a new term for you, though I think it's pretty commonly used, comparisonitis is when you're constantly comparing yourself to other people, and so you're usually finding something lacking about yourself when you're comparing yourself to someone else. In this particular moment, I'm experiencing comparisonitis because it is the 10-year anniversary of publishing my first book. I published my first book, Dying for a Living, on March 4th of 2014, and as I'm recording this, we're just a couple days away from that anniversary. It'll be after the anniversary when this episode is live to the public, because everything goes to my Patreon first. But any kind of anniversary or review always provokes in me this sense of looking back and seeing my progress and then comparing that progress to other people. Because it isn't that I can just look back and see how far I've come in those 10 years of publishing. I have to look back and see how far I've come in those 10 years compared to other people who have also been publishing for 10 years or who have done work for 10 years. And there's a lot that I can be proud of in my 10 years, not only because I've written and published 30 books, which I'm super proud of. I not only finished the Dying for a Living series, which ended up being 7 books long, but I went on to write other series. So the Shadows in the Water series, which is one of my most popular, it has 11 books as of this recording, and I'm going to start writing the 12th one very soon. I've also got a science fiction series. It's called the City series, also called 2603, just because that's the year that it's set in, is 2603. And that is obviously set in the future in a world that I absolutely loved building. I loved playing in that, and I wrote 3 books in that series. And then I wrote 2 fantasy novels, Jack and the Fire Eater, which is a standalone set in an alternative London in sort of the Victorian age, but I say that loosely because it's supposed to be an alternative timeline, so it's not exactly perfect. And then I have Bladeborn, which actually was the 3rd book I wrote, if I'm not mistaken. I wrote Dying for a Living, and then I wrote the sequel, Dying by the Hour, and then I wrote the book that would become Bladeborn, but I wasn't happy with it, and so I kept revising it and revising it and revising it for something like 10 years before I finally published it. So even though I wrote it pretty early, it was pretty recent when I finally published the book, and so I'm proud of that one just for having stuck with it and finally getting it into a shape that I was happy with. So that's my perseverance book for sure. And what else? Oh, I have the 2 Castle Cove novels, the choose your own, we can't say choose your own adventure because that's trademarked, but you make the choices as a reader to where the story goes. And that came of not only just my love of the choose your own adventure books, which I read so many of as a kid, which so was one of my favorite formats, but also because I love like spooky towns full of vampires and werewolves and supernatural stuff. And so it was a chance to combine those 2 loves, have a story set in a spooky town where you could either find romance or you could get eaten alive. And then you could choose your way through the story. So that's how the Castle Cove series started. And I wrote 2 split path, we'll call them novels, meaning you make the choices. But I also have a few short stories set in that town as well that you can find in my Thirst collection. Thirst is another thing I've put together, my short story collection that's focused on vampires. And then the poetry books, and I feel like I'm forgetting something. The memoir, the Who Killed My Mother memoir. But anyway, I've written a lot of books in those 10 years, so I have a lot to be proud of over many different genres. In 2017, I hit the USA Today bestseller list, also another accomplishment. And then as of today, I recently checked my publishing figures, and I have sold over 700,000 copies of books, and that's for all the books combined, in all formats combined, so ebooks, print books, audiobooks, all of it together. I've sold about 700,000 copies of the books. So I have a lot to be proud of as an author, even though I have not met all of my goals. Like, there's a lot of goals that I still have as a writer that I have not yet checked off my list. And probably for that reason, despite everything that I have achieved, I still feel like I fall short in a lot of ways as a writer. And that's primarily driven because I compare myself to other writers too much. I have comparisonitis when it comes to my writing. I look at what other writers have done or what they have accomplished, and I don't measure up by these so-called markers that I seem to think that I should have measured up to. Some of the causes for comparisonitis, some of the factors that make it feel worse, certainly, has been social media. We can use platforms like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever you use on social media, and it creates this sense of how everyone else is doing so much better than we are. And so it makes you feel like you're really struggling or you're really far behind. At least for me, it makes me feel like I'm really far behind or I'm not doing everything that everyone else is doing. And for that reason, I have only myself to blame, that I don't have the level of success that I'm striving for. It could also be social pressure in other contexts, not just online. So if you come from a family or a community where there's a certain level of expectation, whether that be expectation in your success or expectation in your studies, your achievements, if it's expectations in your beauty standards, how you're supposed to look, you can often compare yourself to other people and see that you're not the same, and that might make you feel like, oh, I'm not as beautiful as that person, or I'm not as successful as that person. I haven't achieved as much as that person because of the difference between maybe where you are and where that person is at that given time. Family dynamics also definitely creates this as well. When your family puts undue pressure on you, if you have siblings and you're always being compared to your siblings, certainly I'm sure that you feel this. You feel that there's some kind of unspoken competition between the two of you, or maybe not so unspoken. Maybe it is very loudly spoken, depending on your family. But even if you don't have siblings, or in addition to the sibling issue, we still run into that in any of our other, we'll call them close-knit groups. So that could be peers or friends or colleagues or whomever it is we're interacting with. We can't help but compare ourselves to them, especially if it's a competitive environment of some kind. I'm thinking kind of work right now. So if you're at work, if someone else, quote, performing better than you, whatever that means, is someone climbing the ladder faster than you. I had a friend who she started a job at the same time as one of her, quote, work friends, and the work friend kept getting promoted faster than she did, and she was really beating herself up about it. She was like, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Why is she moving up so much faster than me? And so there was a comparison between her and this work friend. It definitely creates low self-esteem, this comparisonitis, this idea that we're maybe not as good as other people in one way or another. Maybe we're not as smart, or maybe we're not as accomplished, or maybe we're not as beautiful. It's going to change depending on what it is that you're comparing and in what context. But this need to have external validation and kind of reassurance of our worth drives this low self-esteem. And a lot of the times, comparisonitis, at least for me, I can argue for myself anyway, comes from this idea of unrealistic expectations. Either in our lives or our relationships or our careers or our bodies, if we're talking about beauty, comparisonitis. If we continue to compare ourselves against a perfect ideal that we would never be able to attain, but we believe that we should be able to, we will always struggle with this comparisonitis. So for example, all of the things I've accomplished as a writer, and I should be super proud of that, but I can immediately tell you all the things I don't have that I think I should. But they really are in like the top 1% of authors. So being a #1 New York Times bestselling author, for example, which I have not yet achieved, or being a author who has their books turned into TV series or movies, I have not yet achieved that. Even the famous ones that you can think of, so I always think of Stephen King or J.K. Rowling or Lee Child or Danielle Steele or any of these very successful authors, they'll tell you that A, it's not a guarantee that their work will be made into TV shows or movies. And even if they are, there's no guarantee that it will be a positive experience. It could be a horrible experience, the butchering of their content or the butchering of the story, or even that it will survive beyond the first season or the second season. So, for example, I was a really big fan of Leigh Bardugo's Six of Crows, her Shadows and Bones series as well. And the Shadows and Bones series was made into Netflix, I believe, is the one that made it. And it had one great season, and then they didn't renew it. Or maybe it had 2 seasons. But the full thing did not get made, and she was really sad about it. She made a post about it on Instagram. And so this idea that I have a vision that as a successful writer, you have to not only sell your book and it gets made into a movie, and the movie is super popular and it does really well, that's really unrealistic. That's a really unrealistic expectation. But because I have this comparisonitis and I look at these very few authors who have had this experience, I have now made the demand of myself that it must be that way for me also. And that creates that tension, that comparisonitis. But comparisonitis is a mindset issue. And because it's a mindset issue, we address it like we address all mindset issues, which is with self-awareness. First, we have to realize that we're doing it. And then also we need to use self-compassion against it, using self-compassion to try and soften those critical voices bouncing around in our heads, telling us that we're not good enough, telling us to hurry up, to get further along, that we're behind. We have to consciously decide to shift our thinking from the negative, from this place of lack, to the positive. And some of the ways that I do that, or that I try to do that, is I practice gratitude, meaning that I try to be grateful for everything I have accomplished. So, for example, there are many writers who I know who are struggling just to write their first book. And so how ungrateful does it sound for me to say, oh, I've only written 30 and I haven't gotten my dream publishing deal, or I've only written 30 and yeah, I was on the USA Today bestseller list, but not the New York Times. Like, how terrible does that sound to someone who's trying to write their first book or their first 5 books? And so reminding myself of how far I've come and how grateful and to feel privileged for all that I do have, rather than just being like, oh, it's not enough, which is a terrible mindset to have. At least I think for myself, it's a terrible mindset to have. I would like better for my own mind. And so I do try to be grateful for what I do have and to appreciate it in such a way that even if I had no further extension of success, like if this was the most I ever accomplished, if this was the farthest I ever got in my writing career, that I could still be really content and peaceful and happy with what I did have. I also try to limit my social media exposure. As I mentioned, the constant barrage of videos and photos of people living their best life triggers me a bit, and so I have to be really careful about what kind of content I expose myself to, because it gives me the wrong impression that life is perfect for everybody and everybody is doing so much better than me and everybody's so much farther ahead than me, and I just can't expose myself to that too much without my emotions tanking, my self-esteem tanking. So I really have to be mindful about my social media consumption, and similarly, I need to keep a pulse or keep an awareness on those negative thoughts. So when I find myself criticizing my lack of accomplishment or criticizing falling short of a particular goal, I need to notice that, and I need to be very self-affirming to counteract that negative self-talk, to counteract that negativity, to prevent myself from spiraling, taking it too far, just throwing all my accomplishments out the window just because I don't have one thing that I want, which again is a terrible mindset. It's a terrible way to live one's life. And in addition to that, or I guess we could say adjacent to that, it's not just about keeping my mindset in a more positive place. It's also about being compassionate to the negative feelings that I do have. So self-compassion in this context, I've spoken about it before in another episode, but in this particular context, there's a reason why I feel like I have to do these other accomplishments or it's not enough. Like I have to be the absolute best at something or it doesn't matter. And that comes from little Corey, baby traumatized Corey, who was told that unless she was perfect, she was worthless, or unless she achieved everything that could possibly be achieved, she wasn't worth the air in her lungs. And so I understand where those feelings are coming from. And so when I am like, don't think that way or don't talk that way, I try to say it in a more gentle voice in my head. Like, I know you feel like if you don't have this, it doesn't matter. Or I know you feel like if you didn't do it in this perfect way, it's not worthy of love. So I try to be very gentle when I'm challenging these thoughts as well. I'm trying not to bring any self-aggression to the conversation if I can help it. And instead use that time to create goals or focus on some personal growth that is more aligned with my happiness, more aligned with my well-being, So thinking about not just goals that I want to achieve, but things that would be most meaningful to me. So would number one New York Times bestselling author be amazing? Absolutely. Do I want that goal? 100%. But is that really a meaningful goal? Like, is it going to correct my feelings of worthlessness if I have that? I'm not so sure, because that's coming from a different place, and I don't think a book jacket's gonna erase the trauma that's created that feeling. And so having a goal that's more aligned with something meaningful also helps me to recalibrate. So thinking about a project that maybe has a deep spiritual meaning to me or a deep creative meaning to me, if it's a story that means a lot to me. So for example, I didn't have any ambitions for Who Killed My Mother when I wrote it. That project was purely for me. I needed to tell that story to understand the life I had had with my mother and to try to understand her death. And so for that reason, I found that project deeply meaningful and deeply gratifying, even though it isn't a title that I sold the most copies of and I didn't hit the USA Today bestseller list with that title, but it still means a lot to me. And so when I tell stories that mean a lot to me, it helps me to remember what's important rather than getting lost in some of these superficial objectives that are meant to just stave off this emptiness, for lack of a better word, this emptiness that's created by feelings of lack or worthlessness or not measuring up, trying to abate that feeling by achieving more and more and more, which is an endless cycle. The way to heal my feelings of worthlessness or heal my feelings of not being good enough is not by achieving more, because you could never fill up that emptiness with more and more achievements. It doesn't work that way. So shifting my focus not from achievement but to meaning, to purpose, I have also found is a really good way to recalibrate my mind and to move forward from a more centered place, from a more balanced place. Another thing that I've had to do, surprisingly, is I've had to set boundaries around comparisonitis, and that's not just in my own behavior, like telling me I'm not going to do X, Y, and Z, which makes me crazy. Like if I know scrolling social media and looking at everyone's beautiful life for an hour is going to tank my mental health. Not just setting a boundary with myself and being disciplined with myself, but also setting a boundary with the interactions that I have. So for example, I had a friend who really triggered my comparisonitis. It wasn't that she was passive-aggressive exactly, but the way that she would talk about her life or the way that she would present her achievements to me always made me feel like maybe I was being spoken down to or I was being patronized a little bit, like, oh, you're just like this. So for example, she criticized fiction writing pretty easily. She was like, oh, as if it was not as important as nonfiction, like it was just something fun that you do, like something cute. And so whenever I would have these conversations with her, I always felt bad about myself after these conversations. I was like, I don't feel like I'm very accomplished when I talk to someone who treats my interests or my aspirations or ambitions like a joke. And so I had to set a boundary with when I would see her, what we would talk about, and not necessarily to her, because boundaries are mostly for yourself. When you set them, you're creating the circumstances that are best for you. If it comes to a point where you have to say, oh, I don't want to talk about that, or I'm not interested in that, or you try to change the subject subtly and they just don't get it, they keep bringing it back, then you might have to be more direct. But you can be very subtle about it. It can just be something for you, like, I'm not going to do this when I see this person because I know that it's just gonna put me in a bad place mentally. And so I had to set some boundaries with a couple people who I felt were not very good to my sense of self-worth. I don't hold this belief that if someone else succeeds at something, it means that I'm not going to be able to have that. I don't think it's like pie. You heard the analogy that it's not like pie. It's not like there's only so many slices. I think there's enough for everybody. Everyone can be successful in the ways that are meaningful and that matter to them. And so I try to also use other people's success as proof that it can be done. So some of the hardest things that I struggle with is I'm not entirely sure that what I want can be done because I don't see a lot of people doing it. And then I'm like, wow, is it impossible? Does that mean it's impossible to do? And so I take a lot of comfort when I see someone else achieve something, because I'm like, oh, okay, you can do that. Like, it is something that can physically be done. It can actually be achieved in the 3 dimensions. So that's excellent news for me. And I can use that as inspiration for my own progress, my own attempts at doing things. But basically, comparisonitis is natural. It's very natural to compare yourself to other people and see where you rank, how you're measuring up. If you can, try not to make that worse by excessive social media use or by negative self-talk or by breaking yourself down. Be aware that it affects your mental health negatively, that it will tank your self-esteem, your sense of self-worth, and that it is something that has to be managed, and it is managed through a mindset shift. That the sooner you learn how to shift your mind in a way that's more realistic, more positive, more loving, the more quickly you'll be able to reduce those side effects of comparisonitis. The only person you're in a race with is yourself. At least that's what I tell myself. Is that no one is on the same path as me. My path is unique. That is also true for you. No one else is on the exact same path as you. Your path is unique. So it doesn't make sense to compare yourself to other people because you're not traveling the same road. You don't have the same story, so how can you compare them? So as long as you're out there and you're doing what you love and you're making meaningful use of your life, how could you possibly be behind? And that's it for today, dear human. As always, I hope you found this episode useful. And if you would like to write into the show today and ask me for my thoughts on something that you're dealing with, I would love to hear from you through any of my social media or through email, Corey@CoreyMschrum.com. Otherwise, I will be back next week with another episode of A Well Cared For Human. And until then, please take good care of you. This episode of A Well Cared For Human was written and produced by me, Corey Marie. The music was by Late Night Feeler and Esther Abrami. If you like what I'm doing here, please consider visiting my Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to the episodes, as well as a monthly patrons-only Q&A, bonus videos, and more. Not to mention that your Patreon support lets me know that you find value in the show and want it to continue. You can find me on Patreon by visiting www.patreon.com/Corey Marie. If you can't support the show financially, that is okay. You can still subscribe to the show, leave a review of the show, and recommend the show to your friends, not just the neurotic ones. All of this helps so much. And as always, thank you for listening.